Did you know the woman behind the iconic game of Monopoly? Listen to this and more about women game designers with Scott Rogers, game designer and former Imagineer at Walt Disney, on the Hidden Heroines of History podcast today. The past isn't silent, it's buried. Welcome to Hidden Heroines of History. I'm your host, Gayvin Powers, a published author, award-winning screenwriter, and storyteller who brings women's history to life. Welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I am so excited because you have a new game out, and I've known you and your whole family for a long time. It's great to have you on the show. I'm excited for our listeners to find out about all of your experience with game design and a lot of women that have inspired you in your game design. First, we're going to talk about Elizabeth Magie, and she was the inspiration who started Monopoly. And you're going to talk about some other people after that. So I want to turn it over to you and go ahead and take it away, Scott.
I used to do a podcast called Biography of a Board Game, and it was a look at the history of board games in particular and the inventors. You can't help but talk about a game without talking about the inventor and the idea and where it came from. Monopoly is maybe the most well-known from a historical perspective, or at least well-researched game. So I'm not always sure if people know Elizabeth Magie's story or not, but I find her very fascinating. She was a very unique lady. It's fair to say that Monopoly is probably the best-selling board game in the world. And so her contribution to the industry that I work in as a board game designer is incalculable. She's a huge influence. But let's talk a little bit about her and where she came from. She lived in the latter half of the 19th century and passed away in the early 20th century. Her father was very much influenced by an economist, a fellow named Henry George. And Henry George was a bit of a radical in that he didn't think that people should own land. He felt that the land was, a gift from God, and then people could work the land and improve it, and they should profit from any improvement that they do, but they shouldn't own the land. Owning the land was actually a bit sinful in his point of view. Mm-hmm. And so he went around and preached this philosophy, which was known as Georgism. And Elizabeth Magie's father read a book that Henry George wrote and was like, I'm in. I totally get this. This is great. And as a result, Elizabeth also became enamored of this philosophy, this idea that hardworking people should be allowed to keep their profits. Does that sound familiar to very relevant in 2026, right? But Elizabeth, before she invented her tabletop game, she actually was a very interesting woman in that she wrote a lot of poetry that got published. She invented and patented a device that allowed paper to be fed into a typewriter. She also was like the secretary of the Women's Single Tax Club in the Washington, Delaware area. And when Henry George passed away in the late 1890s, she was like, it's a shame this guy died. There's got to be a way to get his message out still. It's an important message. People should know what it is. So she thought, well, maybe making a tabletop game, a board game, would be the best way to get people to understand this philosophy. Now, something to know about tabletop gaming, the history of tabletop gaming. Games themselves are very old. They go all the way back to like 7,000 BC, right? There's games that have been found in tombs and in ancient Sumerian burial grounds. Egyptians have had board games buried with them. And dice are even older than that. We don't actually know how old dice are. But they're definitely, board games are really, outside of theater, are probably one of the earliest forms of entertainment for man. And so there's always been games. But in the 1850s, 60s, this was during the Industrial Revolution. And the process for printing on paper or cardboard, well, paper had been earlier, but cardboard really was the big thing. This was done in Germany. There was a company called Ravensburger. They were kind of the first company to make paper goods for maps and games and things like that. Ravensburger is still in existence. I ended up doing a game for them, and that was, for me, it was a big thrill, partially because of their historical importance. But
Mhm.
board games and what they would call parlor games, because you'd play them in your
Mhm.
parlor with your kids, they became an important part of like the late 80s, early 90s life, partially because there were a lot of illnesses going around. And so parents were like, let's keep our kids inside and have them play board games rather than running out and catching polio or tuberculosis or something like that. And
Mhm.
usually this type of play was run by the women, were mothers mostly, that were getting their kids to stay inside and play games. And they were they're non-violent, and a lot of the real earliest board games were instructional. One was called The Checkered Path of Life. And it's, if you know the game Life, that's what it eventually became.
Mhm.
But The Checkered Path of Life was like, you need to be a good person, because otherwise you might end up in the poorhouse or dead or
Mhm.
whatever. It's a really interesting and funny game to look at through modern eyes. So the mothers were trying to teach their kids morals using
Mhm.
board games. And this was a very common thing in the 18s up through the 1930s or so. And so Elizabeth said, well, since board games are used to instruct people of good moral causes, I will make a game based off of this, showing how evil this single tax land owning land is, right? Because in her
Mhm.
mind, landlords were the worst of the worst. They were charging people lots of money just to live. And
Mhm.
so she said, I'm going to make this game called The Landlord's Game. That was demonstrating how harmful for landlords to have a monopoly on property, and how what was called the value tax was the
Mhm.
cure to this ill in society.
Interesting.
So, if you know, have you played Monopoly?
Sure. Ever
Yeah,
since
right. Right, yeah. I think it's particularly if you're of a certain age, it was ubiquitous. Every
Mhm.
household had a copy of Monopoly in it. And when you play Monopoly, what is the goal of Monopoly, if you remember?
Well, you monopolize the board. You get as many properties as possible, and all your other people that you're playing against go bankrupt.
Yeah, exactly, right. And
Yeah.
so Elizabeth Magie was like, "This is evil."
Mhm.
It's not a good lesson to learn. And so she
Mhm.
thought that by making a game that kind of showed how bad this behavior was, people would wise up and go, "This is bad. I'm against this idea." But
Mhm.
unfortunately, the opposite happened. People were like, "I like making money." And I like screwing over my friends and charging them lots of money in rent. What's interesting about the landlord game is she made an alternate rule set
Mhm.
that was a little bit more in line with her message, where, for example, if you collected rent, it went to a treasury rather than to
Mhm.
landowners, and there was no poorhouse. In the
Mhm.
original version of her game, she had the poorhouse instead of jail. And
Mhm.
so, and that, of course, right there, that shows a huge difference in
Mhm.
thinking, right? Like, oh,
It
where do
sure
you send
does.
poor people? Send them to jail, right? That's
Right,
so
right.
horrible, right? Um,
Mhm.
Now, back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, board games were only a few people were publishing board games. It was Ravensburger, it was a group
Mhm.
called Parker Brothers, and then there was Milton Bradley. They were kind of the main publishers of board games back then. So if you wanted to sell your game, generally you could go through them, but they were very picky. As a matter of fact, both Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley passed on the landlord's game. They were like, this game's too
Hmm.
complex and it's too political. We don't want to
Right.
publish a game about this topic. And
Mhm.
so she was like, well, I'll make my own copies. And so she went ahead, and the way that you would share games back in these days is you would go to your friends and say, check out this cool game I have, and you'd play it. And then they'd be like, I love this game. Where do I get one? And they're like, you don't, you have to make it. And so you would have to get like an oilcloth, and
Oh,
using like
wow.
markers, you'd have to, well, not markers, but crayons to draw on the
Right.
oilcloth. And then you'd have to make your own cardboard cards, and the rule, you have to write down the rules. And
Mhm.
the really fun thing about Monopoly from a historical point of view is the reason why Monopoly has all those cute little knickknacks for
Mhm.
tokens, like a little dog and a hat and a car
Mhm.
and a thimble, is that when you would make your own game, they're like, well, sorry, I don't have any parts for you. You're going to have to like dig through your junk drawer and just use whatever you have. And so that's
Wow.
what those parts represent, is that historical using your household knickknacks to as tokens for the game.
That is so cool. And now we have Star Wars Monopoly. So we've
Yeah.
progressed from regular Monopoly to Star Wars Monopoly, and
Oh,
I
there's all
think we
different types
none
of
of us want to
monopolies.
go to Dagobah. I think that might be the jail
Yeah.
now.
Well, what's really interesting about that, so that retheming of, I mean, this is a very common thing nowadays. As a matter of fact, there's a whole
Mhm,
company used to be called USopoly,
mhm,
or USAopoly, and then they shortened their name down to the Op is their
mhm,
current title. But for many years, the Op would create licensed versions of Monopoly. That was
mm.
there was so much business in making licensed versions. So these Star
Wow.
Wars and, I mean, you name it, any IP that you can think of, SpongeBob and
Mhm,
Lord of the Rings, and there's literally hundreds of these games. So that way, it still the same rules for the most part, still
mhm,
the same layout of the board, that kind of square board with the corners that have those
mhm,
iconic go is one corner and go to jails in another, and free parking is in another, and um, and so those are kind of a hallmark of the modern version of the game. But back when Maggie's version, they were slightly different. I think the free parking was like the park, like you could go
mhm.
to the park and hang out, and then like I
Central
said,
Park.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, an actual park,
Yes.
and then the jail was the poorhouse, so you know
Mhm,
got stuck in the poorhouse because you went into debt. And it had chance cards, things that would kind of move your fate around a little bit, like a little bit of a secondary randomizer. It wasn't until, so like I said, people would make their own versions of the game, and it ended up, there was a fellow named Daniel Lehman who was a student. He was going to Williams College in Williamsburg, Virginia, and he came up with the idea of community chess. He's like, well, there's these cards that have kind of bad things, but there should be cards that have good things. And so he
mhm,
came up in his own version of Monopoly that he called Finance,
mhm,
because the name Monopoly still hadn't been developed yet. It was
mhm,
known as the landlord's game. It was known as finance. People would kind of share their game, and then another, a woman, a gal named Ruth Hoskin. She was a huge fan of the game, and she made her own version to play with her students. She was a
mhm,
teacher, and she lived in Atlantic City, which was kind of a new city. Like Atlantic
mhm,
City was a new place in like the 1870s or 80s, somewhere around there.
mhm.
And so she's the one that said, well, let's name all the streets in Monopoly after Atlantic City.
Wow.
So if you look at the cities in
Mhm,
Monopoly, or the neighborhoods, they're all named after prominent neighborhoods. And then even the train line, like one of the trains is called the Short Line.
mhm.
That's after, there was a train line called the Shore Fast Line, and it was an electric train that could take you to the beach. And so that's where the Short Line is from.
Neat.
Yeah. So this idea of like changing the names of the
Right.
locations predates Monopoly, but it goes all the way almost back to the origins of the game, right? Which is pretty fun.
That's amazing. I love all that historical detail that has gone into that and the evolution of it and how people put their own spins on it, and even how you got into about how they had to pull out the oilcloth and make their own. There's many steps between there and now we're coming to you here with you being a
Yeah.
game designer and everything else. So those are the origins and the beginning, the history of this game design and
Right.
everything else. And how has this influenced you as you've gone on your journey being a game designer?
Well, there's a couple of things that I really love about the early days of, and a lot of game designers got their start in similar fashions, which was
Mhm,
they had an idea for a game. There wasn't really a mechanism for them to sell it, or the companies were so big that you couldn't really, it was hard to approach them. And so they just did it themselves. It was a very pull yourself up and just do it.
mhm,
And for me, that kind of mentality really inspired me when I first started making board games professionally. So my
mhm,
background, like you said, is in video games and some Disney Imagineering and some other fun things. But I was recovering from a very serious illness, and I had a lot of free time on my hands, and I wanted to make a video game. But the irony is, even though I've worked in video games for a long time, I don't program. I'm not a coder. I'm a designer,
mhm,
game designer. I think about gameplay and the way people interact with games and the rules that you need to have and the world building. There's
mhm,
a lot of similarities between game design and like authors such as yourself, right?
Mhm.
You invented a fantasy world, and I invent fantasy worlds every time I create a new game, depending on what the theme
Mhm.
is. And that's one of the things I love about making tabletop games is you're making a little world that can live on a tabletop, and people can immerse themselves via text and cards and other components and things like that. So I had an idea for a game that was called Ray Guns and Rocket Ships, and I had pitched it as a video game. And at the time, the technology wasn't there to support my gameplay vision, and I was becoming very frustrated with this. And plus, it also was very expensive to make video games when I was
Mhm.
at this time. And so, but I also had always loved board games. Some of my earliest memories are playing board games. I worked in high school at a board game store. And so board games have always been a part of my life. And I thought about it one day and I'm like, well, you know what? I really don't need to spend all this money or hire other people to help me. I can just make it as a board game by myself.
Mhm.
And that's like, it's no different than Elizabeth Magie saying, hey, I want to teach people about something. I'll make a board game and that will spread the word. So I made
Mhm.
a game and I ended up getting published, and it was kind of in the early-ish days of Kickstarter. So that, again, another really great mechanism to help people get their ideas out there.
Mhm.
But there's other ways you can do it. You can kind of just reach out to people you know and say, hey, I've got a game and who wants to buy it? And that was actually what I did with my latest game. Was
Mhm.
I jokingly call it a me starter, in that I'm the one, I'm not kickstarting it. It's just
Right.
me doing it. And so I did recently I did a game called I Do My Own Stunts. And I only made 100 copies because that's
Mhm.
about all I could fit in my house. And I live in a very small condo, and I found 100 people that were like, yeah, we want to buy this game from you. And then of course after the game is made, and it takes a little while. It took about 9 months from idea to finally getting it into people's hands, which is
Mhm.
moderately fast. There's other games that have been faster, but it was pretty quick.
Mhm.
But of course, the best part is then people showing off the game and saying, look, I've got
Mhm.
this thing that you made and we're going to play it and we're enjoying it. And then, of course, they're always asking me questions about the rules. Did we do this right? And I have to say, yes, you did it right. Or well, almost. Here's the real answer.
As a writer, I love it when people interact with me with my writing or screenplay, and then I see what I've written, and you're literally walking on a stage, being able to see other people have the experience of something that has come from me that I've created. I love it. There's no other experience like that. So I'd love for you to share with the listeners what it's like for you when people are playing your game, or you get feedback from them, or you get to actually see this creative piece that you put together and then go and play it. How does that feel for you? What is that experience like?
It's fantastic. Games can do a lot of things. They can educate, they can challenge, they can excite, they can scare in some cases, or create wonder. But in general, they are positive. There's a lot of negative things out in the world, and a lot of people that cause negativity. Creating a game gives people happiness. And I want to be in the business of making people happy. This was something that I had always believed in, but I doubled down when I worked for Disney Imagineering. Is their motto was, we're in the business of making people happy. That's their goal. Now, granted, Disneyland is expensive and you can say what you want about the content that they put out. Some people love it, some people hate it. But I had to agree 100% with that mindset of, it's a time well spent and effort well done if the end result is making people happy.
I agree. I completely agree. I think that's a beautiful thing in a world that has so much darkness. Being able to create moments of light and joy and bringing people together, I think that's a gift that
Yeah.
you're giving the world.
The best games do at least one of three things, and that is make people feel smart, make people feel powerful, or make people feel rich. And
Mm,
board games do all three very well. And it's fair to say that most of us don't feel all the three of those things very often. The other thing that I like about games, and video games I think do this even better, but board games also do it, and that is they congratulate or compliment people. They think about how often anybody says to you, good job, you know, you wrote that book, good job, or did your chores today, good job, or you just managed to survive without having some sort of emotional breakdown, good job. Yeah, exactly. That positivity is something that games do really well.
They do.
And again, I I need it just as much as anybody else does. And so that's one of the things that I love about games is that they keep me feeling positive. Now,
Yeah.
can games get you mad and people can flip the table in their anger at a game or something, and that happens, but more often than not, it's most of the time games are a positive experience.
I completely agree.
Of
And
course.
talking about the women that had inspired you as you were developing your games.
So there's a lot of one of the kind of shames for a long time in the tabletop industry was that women often didn't get credit. So there's a bit of a dark part of the Monopoly story, and that is that there was a fella named Charles Darrow who played another friend's copy of what was the landlord game, although I think it was maybe called Finance or something when he played it, or
Mhm.
maybe it was just Monopoly. I think it was just Monopoly. But he essentially made his own copy and then sold it to Parker Brothers and said, "Oh, I invented this game." So he took a whole credit, of course, because this is what happens,
Mhm.
unfortunately. So he took credit for the game, and he ended up, of course, becoming a millionaire because of it.
Mhm.
Parker Brothers sold millions of copies. Like the first year alone, they sold like 7,500 copies, and eventually, like I think the last bit of data that I have was in like oh gosh, like 250 million copies as of 2016. Yeah, and that's back then, right? I mean, we are another 10 years out from that, right? So it's got
Wow.
to be past at least 500,000 by this point.
Mhm.
Anyway, very profitable for Charles Darrow. Now the thing about Darrow was he was kind of desperate. He had a son with a very serious illness. He was out of work, and so he was very hungry to find a way to make a living. But people fairly would say that he stole this game. At least he didn't
Mhm.
bother to find out where it came from. He just took full
Mhm.
credit for it. But in 1973, there was a fellow named Ralph Anspach, and he made a game because he always thought Monopoly was a horrible game. He was like, "This game is
Mhm.
so odious; it teaches people how to be, bad behavior, and that greed is good and all that." And he was like, "I don't agree with that." So he made a game called Anti-Monopoly, which was kind of a parody of Monopoly, that
Mhm.
kind of showed how he was like he was an economist. Ironically, he ended up matching Maggie's vision for the game without realizing it at first. So Anti-Monopoly
Mhm.
was this game that was very similar in philosophy to the landlord's game. But Parker Brothers by that point was like, "Hey, you're ripping off our game. You're using the name in your game. We're going to sue you."
Wow.
In the course of the lawsuit, Anspach found proof, patents, and other things like that. Thank goodness Elizabeth Magie patented her game. Like I said, she had patented other things, so she had experience doing this, that's really what helped her case. He found out that Elizabeth Magie was the original inventor, and that Parker Brothers had bought her out for $500
Mm.
back in the day. Yeah, right. Uh,
Not even 1% of 1% at this
No,
point.
no, yeah, just $500. And the other thing was Maggie was like, "Well, I'll sell it for $500, but you also have to publish the landlord's game." But the problem was when they published the landlord's game, everyone was like, "This is too close to Monopoly and you're causing confusion." And retailers were like, "We're not going to sell Monopoly if you are trying to get us to sell this other game that's pretty much the same thing." And so Parker Brothers was like, "Fine, excuse me." They recalled almost all the copies of the landlord game and pulped them
Oh.
because they were like, "Well, we can't have this happening in the marketplace." So Elizabeth Magie was devastated by this, and then she sees Monopoly go on to be this huge success. So
Mhm.
Ralph Anspach, in his case, he proved that Darrow had stolen Maggie's game design, and it led to her finally getting recognition and some financial restitution. It's never been clarified how much,
Mhm.
but hopefully she got enough. Obviously, it wasn't the money that Darrow got, because Darrow just
Mhm.
like became a multimillionaire and just traveled the world and lived in comfort for the rest of his life. Maggie at least got some justice out of it thanks to Ralph Anspach. But still, it's this kind of same old story that you hear of these creators that have made these games and either robbed of the credit or
Mhm.
the profit that they should have been owed. And so that was another thing for me is I'm like, well, unfortunately, I got to learn. I mean, I had learned this lesson through other people as well in
Hmm.
different industries. But again, that lesson was like, well, you got to protect what you create, and you've got to make sure that if somebody challenges it, you got to fight for it. And so that was an inspiration as well: is publish it yourself if nobody else will do it, and make sure you defend your rights. You know, stand up for yourself. So those were
Hmm.
really good lessons, even though Elizabeth Magie didn't quite benefit from them. You know, it's often we learn the right way to do something by seeing someone else do it the wrong way.
But I think you also bring up a really good point because that does happen in the creative fields that people's intellectual properties get stolen a lot. And
Yeah,
even if you protect it, even if you get your writing copy written, even if, Elizabeth Magie, she had hers protected as well, people will still come along and be like, hey, that's a great idea. And
right.
I know so and so and so and so, and they're going to go make it for me. So you have to be careful. And you bring up a really good point. And that happens regardless of gender.
Yeah, for sure. And it was a lot easier for that to happen. Now there's a lot more paper trail, as it were. And
Mhm.
but when I talk to young game designers, and they're like, often young game designers will say, "Well, should I patent my game?" Now the irony is in there. There's kind of two worlds to the tabletop game industry. One
Mhm.
is mass market, and so these are Hasbro and Mattel and Goliath Games and big companies. So if you go into like Walmart or Target, those are for the most part those are kind of the bigger companies. They're more traditionally toy companies, and there's a culture of protecting inventions in that industry of patenting and trademarking and copywriting, which is great and it's good. But the hobby game industry is a little more immature, and we're starting to see a lot of hobby games or we have for about 15, 20 years now, but things
Mhm.
like Settlers of Catan or Carcassonne or more modern games like Flamecraft or Everdale. You can go into a Target and find these. They're known as hobby games. Often you'll find them at board game stores because there are
Mhm.
specific stores that you can go to that just sell board games. And that industry frowns upon patenting a game because they see it as kind of this aggressive move because they're like, well, you're keeping other people from being creative, and how dare you um, um, do this? But from inventor's point of view, it's you're protecting yourself. So I can see both sides of the argument, but I personally feel like, well, it's very hard to patent something. Now, I say
Mhm.
this as somebody who actually owns a patent on a board game, and it took me 3 4 years to get the patent,
Wow.
but it also I feel was an idea that is very unique, and that's one of the
Mhm.
major criteria of getting a patent. It has to be something that either is constructed in a very unique way or is a what they call a method pattern, which is what I have,
Mhm.
which is a way of playing something. So Elizabeth Magie was able to patent Monopoly mainly based on the form factor of the board because it
Mhm.
was that idea of an endless board was
Mhm.
original. That had never really been done before. Games
Okay.
kind of had a beginning and an end, and that was it.
Mhm.
But hers, you could just keep looping over and over again. And then she had a few other ideas as well that were original. But that form factor was how she was able to patent it. And so again, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of money. It's not cheap to patent a game,
Mm.
but you can do it, and then you only get the patent for like 75 years or something. It's like the life of the inventor plus like so many years after that, 25 or 35 years.
To everyone who is doing their part, being creative, fighting against the tide, doing what they can to make the world a little bit better, using their creativity to do it. Scott, who would you like to add to dedicate this podcast to?
Let's toast to all the women who shoulders we stand upon in our creative endeavors, whether they're authors or game designers or something else. They don't get as much credit as they should, and so let's do what we can to shine a light on them and make sure that they have their moment.
Absolutely.
Here, here.
Cheers. Cheers. We'll see you again. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.
Stay tuned for part two with Scott Rogers as we talk about the women behind Skipbo, Candyland, and Quirkle. If you enjoyed this, like, share, and subscribe. We have more amazing episodes planned. You can listen to them on the Hidden Heroines of History podcast on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and iHeartRadio.